Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Prince Eye on China column, I explored the Chinese discourse on the Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to China. So, his latest visit to China was his 25th visit to the country as the president. And in Chinese discourse, the visit has been presented as a proof that Beijing and Moscow are entering an even deeper phase of strategic coordination. But beyond the symbolism, the visit also reveals how China is increasingly seeing itself. And after looking at the discourse, it is pretty clear that China sees itself as a central force in an emerging multipolar world. And Chinese social media reacted intensely to Putin's arrival as well. So, images, videos that emerged on the Chinese social media, on the internet, of Russian and Chinese flags lining along the Beijing airport expressway spread rapidly online. And with many users calling this as the strongest phase of the bilateral relationship, the symbolism was pretty high, and citing the images of flags was one of the examples, one of the evidences for calling it as one of the strongest phases of bilateral relation between China and Russia. So, some online accounts even claim that several Russian military transport aircraft had landed in Beijing ahead of Putin's arrival, which generated a lot of online buzz. And it was kind of similar to that of how it was discussed during before Donald Trump's visit to China. That was my column last week. And there was a lot of discussion about how there was uh, a lot of preparation, a lot of equipment, machinery, aircraft that was landed in Beijing before Trump's visit. So that there was some similarity between the discussion about Putin's visit and Trump's visit. But former Global Times editor in chief Hu Shijin cautioned against overriding this argument that the two uh, visits are linked. He actually cautioned against not reading too much between the lines. And on Weibo, he wrote that Putin's trip to China is now a part of a long standing pattern of institutionalized engagement rather than reactive geopolitical signaling. So basically, it is not really an outcome of Trump's visit to China, but it stands on its own feet. And then Chinese commentary surrounding the visit also reflected a broader narrative, and what it is that Beijing is becoming one of the world key diplomatic centers. In fact, there was this analysis on the Chinese internet that this year all the UN permanent members have actually visited China, and perhaps the only country that has got so many leaders this year. So all the roads lead to China, everyone is going to China. And analysts actually pointed to the steady flow of visiting world leaders as kind of an evidence of China's growing international influence, international clout. And Chen Fengying, who's former researcher at the China Academy of Contemporary International Relations, argued that these exchanges show the international community that it understands China better now. It wants to get closer to China, and it now trusts China more. So the message seems to be that China sees its political stability, perceived political stability, technological rise, manufacturing strength, and market size as the foundations of a new global role. And in this reading, in this framing, the world is gradually moving away from a Western dominated unipolar order. And it is moving towards a more multipolar system in which China occupies a central position. So, Chinese analysts repeatedly stressed that Putin's visit should not be viewed through the lens of Trump's recent visit. And Straight News commentator Ping Chun argued that the visit serves three major purposes. First, commemorating diplomatic milestones. And what are these milestones? So, 2026 is the 30th year of the diplomatic ties between Russia and Moscow. And this is also the 25th year of the signing of Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. Then the second objective is that what the two countries want to do is to expand practical cooperation in um, areas that are mutually beneficial to both the countries. And third, what they want to do is to coordinate responses to an increasingly uncertain global environment. But Shan Yi, who's professor in the Department of International Politics at Fudan University. He's also one of the most prominent voices on Weibo on Chinese internet. He argued that China-Russia relations have now entered a more stable and institutionalized phase. And according to Shan, high level exchanges like the recently concluded visit are now routine features of a long term diplomatic rhythm rather than short term geopolitical reactions. Something very similar to what Hu Shichen also said. And areas of cooperation continue expanding: energy, trade, local currency settlements, technology, education, coordination through organizations such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. So, Chinese discussion also highlighted efforts to reduce dependence on the US dollar through greater use of yuan ruble settlements. So, but at the same time, Chinese commentary acknowledged the changing balance within the relationship. Of course, we have seen discussions about Russia being a junior partner of China, particularly since the Ukraine war and how the sanctions have caused, enabled Russia to move towards China more, and now the equation has completely changed. But before this visit, uh, I hardly saw any discussion about Russia being a junior partner. Of course, the indications were very much there, but I think there was some subtle indication. It wasn't outright Uh, explanation of Russia being a junior partner. So, of course, since the Ukraine war and it's still ongoing, and Western sanctions, Russia's dependence on China, we have seen, has increased substantially. In fact, China is one of the most open uh, markets for Russia. So, it absolutely makes sense that how Russia is so dependent on China now. And of course, China has been using that to its advantage. So, energy exports, Chinese markets have become increasingly important for Moscow. And here, some Chinese scholars are also revisiting broader discussions about Eurasia itself. For instance, Sui Hongqian, who's professor at the Institute for Advanced Study of Regional and Global Governance at Beijing Foreign Studies University, he argues that China Russia coordination could play a stabilizing role across Eurasia, and they could link Asia, Europe, and even the Arctic through infrastructure, trade, and security arrangements. Meanwhile, another scholar, Feng Shaolei, director of the Russia Research Center at East China Normal University, he opines that China Russia ties are driven primarily by strategic independence and national development priorities, and it is hardly impacted by the opposition to the West. So it is actually not a relationship, according to Feng, that is aimed at the US, or it's not really anti West. So some Chinese commentary also interpreted the visit through the shifting, changing triangle of China, Russia, and the United States. And one argument emerging in Chinese discussion is that improving and somewhat a reset in China US relations does not necessarily weaken China Russia ties. Of course, they have to talk about it. Of course, they have to say that China US relationship is independent of what happens in China Russia ties, vice versa. So instead, Moscow appears increasingly focused on strengthening non Western partnerships in a multipolar world. And to quote another scholar, Chang Chani, who holds a PhD in international relations from Moscow State University, argued that Russia's renewed emphasis on the Russia India China RIC framework reflects Moscow's attempt to preserve its relevance as a Eurasian power. And this is despite growing geopolitical pressure. But even Chinese analysts acknowledged the limitations of the framework, especially deep mistrust between China and India. So even though Russia wants to revive the RIC and it does work to its advantage, there are limitations, there are extent to how RIC could work for Russia and how China and India could actually work together with Russia. So there are, of course, a lot of concerns, a lot of speculations regarding if it's actually workable at all. But in my view, and perhaps the most striking aspect of Chinese commentary, according surrounding the visit this time, was what it avoided and not what it actually talked about. So compared to previous years, there was far less overt anti-Western rhetoric. Of course, this just happened after Trump's visit, so that was a little bit obvious that the anti-Western rhetoric would not be there. But I think that was just very striking that how there was a complete absence of anti-Western rhetoric this time, and the focus was primarily on how Russia-China relations stand on their own feet and they engage on their own terms, and then China could actually engage with the US and Russia at the same time. So instead of talking about the Western, the anti-US, anti-West coalition, the Chinese analyst actually framed the China-Russia relationship as more mature, as more durable, and becoming more and more institutionalized. So the focus was more on China-Russia relations rather than the US this time, and that was absolutely a distinction and a departure from the past precedents. So, in my view, the goal from the Chinese side appears to be projecting stability rather than confrontation with the US. And in many ways, his visit was as much about China's global image as it was about Russia itself. And Beijing increasingly wants the world to see it as one of the central architects of the emerging international order, and a country where multiple world leaders are coming and trying to work and trying to cooperate with China. So I think this is a primary message from the Chinese discourse on the visits that have happened in the past months. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.